It's showtime.
It's showtime.
It's showtime. All right. So we are live now. I'm going to go ahead and share on LinkedIn the stream so that folks can join. And I believe that we're sharing this on Twitter today as well.
If I could remember my Twitter login, I would do that.
I think I can tag you.
I'm joking. I can share this on Twitter.
Here we go. So question for you. What is your Twitter handle?
My own personal one. No, the corporate one is Cycura Corp. Is where we be on Twitter. We don't do much with Twitter.
There you go. Well, you're streaming live now. Okay, so we've got a decent amount to talk about today. Data breach, FBI email breach, and I think so. The province of British Columbia has seceded from the rest of Canada over the last couple of days. Not intentionally, of course, but I think with the flooding that we've received, we are no longer connected to the rest of our great country.
You guys beat Alberta to it. I know they were.
Unfortunately, it's not a good situation. So let me actually start there. So obviously we've had a lot of flooding here on the West Coast, and that has caused, as people have seen, I think it's caused actually in the town of Victoria, or the city of Victoria, I believe that we are effectively out of gasoline. So similar to what happened when the Colonial Pipeline attack took place, where there's just been panic buying of people trying to fuel up their vehicles. So there's a state of unease, I would say, locally. And then just at a provincial level, a lot of the major transportation routes, including both rail as well as roads, are disrupted, cut off, etc. So this is happening for natural disaster reasons. But I'm curious, from a cybersecurity perspective, who should be on the lookout? Well, actually, let me back up. First question is, will attackers take advantage of a situation like this to conduct cyber attacks, in your opinion?
Not usually on the scale that we would be super worried about, like industry-wide. Usually what happens during events like this is you get a bunch of fraud that springs up, right? So fraud perpetuated in the nature of fake charities, fake GoFundMes and things like that. And then even going as far as we've seen attackers stand up sites that look like legit Red Cross sites or something from the Canadian government. And they are, taking credit card payments, but really what they're doing is just swiping cards, right? And then getting the numbers and your CVE or CVC, CCV, whatever it is, and then selling those online, right? Or using them to perpetuate card fraud. So it's not like big picture cyber fraud or cyber attacks that we typically see during these events. It's usually more small scale stuff. I think if anything, what could be the case is if somebody chooses to launch something more large scale, the impact and amplitude of that right now is more pronounced, right? If you go and attack, to your point, one of these infrastructure type of agencies that's just currently crippled and trying to deal with something right now, like, just day-to-day operations, you suddenly piling in with a ransomware attack or something like that just makes life even worse. You might get, if you're an attacker, you might get a more desirable outcome there because they're like, man, we're trying to deal with like roads that are washed out. Like, here's your 4 Bitcoins, go away, right? Just give us our stuff back. So that might be an outcome, but I'd say the fraud side of things is definitely where we see most activity.
And from a fraud perspective, you're talking mostly about consumer fraud as opposed to B2B, like business email compromise, for instance.
Sometimes it does take the form of business email compromise. That's a good point, right? So sometimes these attackers sometimes the same groups, not usually, but you will get groups that will create, would your business like to donate to, the recovery fund? And then the fraud still perpetuates kind of the same way, but the dollar amounts usually are going to be bigger, right? Because a business is more likely to donate $2 to $4 grand or something like that, or wire $2 to $4 grand to a bank account that they think is, part of the Red Cross or whatever, and it's not.
So on that note, I actually had a situation yesterday. Someone reached out to me, and they were on the phone with their bank because a customer of theirs had received an email that looked like it came from this business. They had actually copied an email chain from someone else, and they had put in a set of wire details that was not my friend's company's.
Yep.
So what was interesting, I thought, is that the email itself came from a domain it was effectively a typo domain. So it was their domain name, but one letter was off. But they'd somehow copied a full email thread to the finance from the finance department. So in a situation like that, where you suddenly discover that, hey, somebody has gotten a copy of an email somewhere, they've sent it to another business counterparty, what are the first set of items that a business should do when they're in that situation?
Yeah, we worked on an IR of the exact same nature, with same types of attack methodology that you're describing, or like same behavior of the attacker that you're describing. And it got to a certain point up until the bank basically reached out to the known contact and was like, hey, some of this just doesn't quite feel right. But what they provided was this email chain of, about 10 emails, communications from this attacker who had done the same thing. So they had originally, our findings were that they had originally compromised the accounts of this controller for this company, the Office 365 account that this controller was using for email, and gone through their mailbox, snagged, an email chain that was interesting. It was related to a forthcoming transaction, right? So the attacker knew there was going to be a couple $100,000 that was going to have to be wired between two institutions at some point. And that was the thread that they decided to latch onto. And then they did the same thing that you said. They moved it to a typo account, or to a typo domain, where they were running the mail server. And the reason that they're doing this is because the longer that they're in and manipulating the mailbox of the actual controller, the more likely they are that they're going to make a mistake, or the controller is going to be logged in at the same time and see something come up in their inbox that they can't delete in time, or something going out of the sent mail that doesn't make sense to them, right? So what they want to do is bring the conversation over into that typo domain that they control, and then they can make the conversation take place over several business days, like it probably would have to, rather than trying to push everything through in 4 hours and raising alarms even higher than they normally might be. So what should you? Sorry, go ahead.
So even though it's a typo domain, the suspicion would be, or the fear would be, hey, they've probably compromised an email system somewhere, because that's how they got access to the original thread, or the 10 emails in the thread that you'd indicated.
Usually it's not like compromise. Well, I mean, if you're on your own hosted exchange, then yeah, they might have popped your exchange, right? But that's going to be worse problems than this. Most of these are Office 365, like I said, and it's just been reuse of passwords and no MFA, right? Like it's the most common thing is that controller is logging in using the same creds that they use on some sports site that they visit or something like that, and that's how they're getting logged in. So, but these people are profiling people like that. That is part of it too, right? They're crawling LinkedIn. They're finding people who belong to businesses who have controller or accountant in their job title, because that's who they want to go after here.
So Kevin brings up a good question. What about fraud rings and actually working with insider threats?
Yeah, definitely a problem, usually taking place mostly we would see in larger organizations. Certainly could happen in smaller organizations too, though. But usually larger organizations at least have the wherewithal to detect this type of threat. The problem with any sort of insider threat is it's hard to understand the intention behind somebody's communication, and also like you're trying not to snoop on your employees. So there's a balance there of trying to monitor employee behavior, and also not fall afoul of any sort of privacy violations. Even though these people are working like on your equipment on your time, there shouldn't be a reasonable expectation of privacy. That is like a fine line to walk. Insiders, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it's also hard, particularly in financial services, because an insider threat is really somebody who is doing something nefarious, but their intentions may be malicious. It may be that, hey, they've just gotten really pissed off at the organization, and they feel that they've personally been wronged, and they're going to take it out on the organization. But it's also possible that maybe this person is under threat. I mean, we've seen situations in financial services where we're not concerned about the insider being malicious for the sake of being malicious. It's not a disgruntled insider, but it's actually that somebody else in their family maybe has a health issue. They need $10,000 to take care of that health issue. And now they're going to work with the bad guys to facilitate something. And so it's almost an altruistic motive that they have, but the net effect is still the same. You have an inside party with access who is collaborating with somebody on the outside to facilitate that transaction.
Yeah, I think one of the more interesting spaces, like you mentioned, financial services, and that's definitely like a high risk area for this type of problem. One of the more interesting spaces that we've seen a lot of this in recent years too has been in like telcos. And so where this is taking a lot of root and having big impact is you've got malicious insiders working inside. When I say telcos, I'm talking about like the mobile arms of like Rogers and Telus and Bell and any of them, and they have access to customer accounts, and they have the ability to perform SIM swaps on devices, right? And so they are working with and on behalf of organized crime groups and attacker groups. They're identifying high value targets, or the groups are, and then they are taking a payment in order to swap the IMEI of a device temporarily, just long enough so that you can bypass two-factor authentication by submitting a password reset and to gain access to a mail account, or have a push SMS pushed to the phone that you now control. A lot of these things happen overnight when somebody's not looking at their phone. And then you find out 2 days later that you've had some sort of compromise, and you can't really figure out how it happened because I have two-factor turned on my phone and stuff like that. And a lot of the times the malicious insider is part of that equation that we just can't solve for right now. You really have to get into profiling your employees and doing not just like one-time background checks, but kind of ongoing background checks to understand who's working for you, especially if they're in a position where they have access to customer data or have access to financial systems that they could potentially use for fraud.
Well, and I think that the government equivalent to this, if we think about security clearances as an example, it's very common that you have to submit a financial picture, because if you're bankrupt or if you're hugely in debt, obviously that's going to be a risk that somebody could use against you. And so it's the same type of idea. Good to see you, Mohammed. So I think Mohammed was commenting earlier on maybe insecure passwords being used, and that's again how somebody could log in. I think also going back to your point about SIM swaps. I mean, we're using the technical vernacular here to talk about somebody stealing somebody else's phone number, and the reason that's important in a security context is when you get that 6-digit number to type into a login system, that can be rerouted to somewhere else, and ultimately that's how it gets compromised. Interesting. Also, you're talking about bigger companies with larger customer databases. I saw there was an article that you were mentioning just recently from Wired that's come out. Very long expose on Amazon. And the thing that I found interesting in talking about their customer support organization is just how much access their customer support reps had to the underlying data. So maybe walk us through what was discovered there.
Just for Mohammed's sake, I'd say spring 2012 or spring 2019 when we're talking about great passwords use. Yeah, the Wired article is a really good article. Amazon, not AWS, but to your point, their retail side that everybody buys everything from. What it looks like is there just is a complete lack of the concept of least privilege going on inside, at least based on this article and the time frame that was mentioned, and all the people that they interviewed. I mean, I have no visibility to what goes on inside Amazon, but I will say through my own experience, working with CSRs, like they've gone to a decent length to validate me. So I'm hoping there's some improved processes there. But based on the article, it just sounds like there was and is many ways that systems there share data interdependently and too freely. The article mentioned like the ability for CSRs and developers, even third parties, to exploit the APIs that are exposed to get you as the consumer, your entire transaction history, for example, right? And your buying patterns and stuff like that. And so, the article talks about CSRs looking up like celebrities information, what people are buying, where they live. Like they named Kanye West specifically, right? Who I guess buy stuff from Amazon. And so, I liken that to my time in the healthcare space, where we had VIP records in the hospital systems.
Yep.
And they are supposed to be behind glass, and you need to have very special privileges to look into those. Otherwise it gets flagged. Or you have to break the glass, so to speak, to look at those. But
same thing, by the way, happens in insurance. So it's a very, very common problem where, hey, wouldn't it be interesting to go see if the local, I don't know, hockey players or football players, how many accidents have they been in? Well, let's just go look up their driving records in the motor vehicle. I mean, anytime you're storing PII, personally identifiable information, you're going to run into this celebrity or VIP problem. And being able to track who has access to that data. What is the chain of ownership effectively for that data? And not just who writes to it. I mean, who makes changes, that's important, but also understanding who has read it, like who's actually accessed these things. And I think to your point, the Wired article said that there was something like 22,000 employees had higher levels of permissions than was maybe necessary to affect their role.
Yeah. And the other thing that the article calls out is really fascinating when you think about it. Like, it said Amazon's data set was the largest Oracle database before they moved off Oracle on the planet by a factor of 1,000, right? And there's some massive data sets out there in Oracle databases. So, they have this massive data scale problem, and then they were using the data and replicating it all over the place to make it more accessible, to make it, to make it agile. It sounds like a lot of, principles of security and principles of data privacy and access were not really applied appropriately in order to enable business process speed. So they built a car that goes super fast, but it has no brakes or very undersized brakes for how fast the car is going. So,
well, and agree with you, Mohammed. I mean, a lot of this does come down to good hygiene, good patching, good password practices. I think that the solution to these problems is not quantum. I mean, sure, quantum could help, I'm sure, in some situations, but the solutions to these problems we already know. They exist, and they simply need to be deployed and implemented. Changing gears, and this is actually an update from the conversation we had last time. Newfoundland healthcare.
Yep.
They're not doing so good. Turns out, actually, Canada is not having good luck on either coast, either on the West Coast or on the far East Coast.
We're fine here in the middle, man.
All you can do is laugh, because it's a pretty bleak picture. But it is now we've now had a little bit of update from the original Newfoundland healthcare attack. and it looks like we have better visibility on what data was accessed. And it seems as though healthcare data going back for the last 13 to 14 years, approximately, and that includes every patient, or likely patients who have visited in the last 14 years to a healthcare institution in Newfoundland. And that includes name, address, the reason for visit, doctor, phone number, birth date, email address, mother's maiden name, marital status. So everything that you would need to for identity fraud. And also employee information. So employees' names, address, contact information, social insurance number. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's really interesting that there's kind of two conflicting opinions that are coming out here. So you've got Justice Minister Hogan. John Hogan. Access to data does not mean that it was copied, does not mean that it was taken, he said. And then you've got the CEO, David Diamond of Eastern Healthcare, saying that anybody who's been to a hospital in the region in the last 14 years should assume that their data has been stolen. And the nuance there is really important. If my data was accessed, it means somebody could have just logged in and looked at it and, I don't know, wrote it down or screenshotted it or something, maybe, right? The reality of how data is stored in clinical systems, right, in a hospital information system, particularly like the ones that they use on the East Coast, which I think it's Meditech. It's either Meditech or Epic, right? But it's like this big homogenous system that they use out there, as far as I'm aware. You generally don't go in and just like dump the database out to a flat file and punt it out the door. Usually it's like the access is regulated through your access into the system and your ability to log in and browse through it. Now, could they have gotten back-end access to the server infrastructure itself and compromised that and pulled it all out? Maybe. We need more technical details to understand that. But right now, what is not really clear to me is whether people had access as, some sort of hospital administrator, and then that would give them permission to go and look at anybody's records, or did somebody wholesale extrapolate or exfiltrate, the entire data set out, for offline, resell at some point on some dark market? Like, that's not clear at this point, and until somebody comes out and says that, that's what I'm hearing from David Diamond, basically, is like everything got stolen. It doesn't sound like the government wants to say that yet.
Well, and it also closes with saying the privacy commissioner is investigating. So to a certain extent, I think that the flow of information to the general public is likely going to slow down a little bit as the investigations continue. The thing that I find interesting here is that the fact that it was both patient data as well as employee data, to me, would suggest some sort of database level access. Because if it was simply healthcare data, then yeah, you could access that through electronic medical record system and EMR system. But you wouldn't be able to pivot then into getting employee data. Whereas if you just had a database level access, it's more likely that you'd just be able to pull both tables, the patient records as well as the employee records. But it also might indicate why they're having trouble identifying what was accessed. Because if you're at a lower level, you may not have the logs to say what was actually pulled. And so to me, it feels more like kind of systems level, database level access, that they're trying to infer what was exactly done with that access. The other thing that's not here is we don't know the dwell time. How long was that attacker in place? How long did they have to exfiltrate the data? And if it was a long time, presumably, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but if it was a long time, particularly if it was sometime in the past, they may not have the network records, the network logs, to go back and look, did somebody transfer 100 gigs of data 3 years ago?
That is the problem that you run into with every like big IR that you go into when you get into a network that just doesn't have instrumentation and visibility. And to your point, logging. What's kind of crazy is like in healthcare, we're really good at logging anything related to health data for 7 years plus, or in this case, 14 years, right? Like, that's great. You've got logs. But it's logs of like that health record. It's not logs about the systems that host it and are critical to presenting and providing them and maintaining them and backing them up. To your point, you're probably lucky if you've got 90 days worth of network logs. And that's going to be network, like there's levels of logging. And by default, most systems do not have granular levels of logging turned on because it generates big logs and a lot of them.
It's expensive.
And that takes up disk space, and you're like, what am I doing this for, right? So unless you've got like a good SIM in place, right, and that you're dumping logs into that, and you've got more visibility than most places do, or some sort of centralized logging that you're dumping everything into for, offline consumption later, you probably, to your point, don't have enough log information to make a determination here. And that's what they're trying to solve for. They're going back through any firewall, any portal, any system that has any level of logging to figure out, did somebody just go and scrape this thing out at the SQL Oracle, level? They just ran a backup command and pulled it to another machine and then punted it out the door, which is how I would do it.
Well, and going back to the conversation around Amazon, I mean, again, in that Wired article, they ran into the exact same situation. There was a treasure trove of data. It was accidentally stored in a place that was outside the firewall, and so it could have been accessed. But because it had been sitting out there for so long, they'd only kept, in Amazon's case, they'd only kept 90 days worth of access logs, and so they couldn't know if it was accessed. Maybe nobody found it. But there was the chance that it was sitting vulnerable. It was just left out there. I think in the article, the example was, imagine if you're a bank and you just left a bag of money out back behind the bank, but you never really know if anybody went to go get the bag. You just have to kind of assume, well, either what was there. I mean, bad example, because you would know if somebody took the bag, but maybe somebody looked at the bag, right? The bag of money. We're getting close to kind of wrapping up here. Last one that I'm very curious to get your thoughts on. So there was the last just in the last couple of days, article came out saying that there were fake emails being sent that claimed to be from the FBI, and it looks like they may have actually come from a genuine FBI email server or service, as well as coming from the Department of Homeland Security. What do we think about this?
Yeah, I mean, it does sound like they did genuinely come from the FBI. And what it sounds like was that there was a vulnerability on a website that they ran that allowed emails to be generated from that domain. So some sort of misconfigured service that allowed them. Krebs put out an email, or put out an article on it. But yeah, it did genuinely come from a real ic.fbi.gov domain. So,
which would be intimidating. If I got an email from ic.fbi.gov, I mean, that would be concerning, right? I would, that is not your typical spam or phishing email. That's something that you take with a little bit more seriousness. Now, interestingly, Brian Krebs, very well-known cybersecurity reporter, did put out an article. I think the reason that he put it out is that the attacker in this case, who's named Pom Pom Purin, took responsibility for the incident and claimed that this was the reason that he affected this attack was he wanted to go show the world that there was a vulnerability that needed to be looked at. How common is that motive or purported motive to exploit something for the sake of publicizing it so that it can be fixed?
Doing it to the FBI is incredibly stupid. But what we do run into a lot is what I'll call beg bounties, which is not a bug bounty. It's kind of the opposite. It's when an organization is approached by a security researcher, and there was actually a Twitter thread going on a couple of weeks ago about this. And it seems to largely be like a handful of like aliases and people, saying, hey, there's a critical vulnerability in your system, and I'd like to show it to you, pay me. And these aren't critical vulnerabilities. They're like basic stuff that you pick up with a vuln scanner that are not really high risk exploitable. But these security researchers in those situations are really trying to exploit companies who don't understand what some of these technical terms are, and make them feel that they have a big security hole, with their website or their operation. So that seems to be fairly common. What this person did here is pretty wild. The actual attack itself is a simple post request that caused the server to allow them to then send data through the server. So it's like a super old school kind of low level bug that they exploited. But doing that to the FBI, like, you probably could have notified them and gotten $5,000 or something like that. In this case, this person is now on a shit list that I wouldn't want to be on.
So in the case of a business getting that email from a quote security researcher saying, "Hey, I've just discovered a critical vulnerability, pay me and I will tell you what it is," what is a business owner supposed to do?
Largely, I'd ignore it. Quite honestly, I'd ignore it. If you don't have a legitimate bug bounty in place, what we have found, because we've had to counsel a couple of businesses on these, is that the nature of these vulnerabilities is usually not particularly significant. It's some sort of like low-level cross-site scripting that's impossible to exploit, or a clickjacking vulnerability, or something that can only be exploited in conjunction with some sort of other vulnerability. So it's like somebody ran a vuln scanner and it came up with something informational, and this person's trying to make it sound like it's horrendous. That's what we've seen almost all of them to be. So
yeah, we've come across a few as well. And to your point, it's a very automated attack. They run a vulnerability scanner. They can do that at scale. They can mass personalize the emails to all of the quote affected businesses. Yeah. In some cases, this is actually a great use of AI by the bad guys, because doing that mass personalization, you can use some flavor of artificial intelligence to generate that copy. So the bad guys have access to AI now as well. And they send it out. And much like other spam campaigns, they only need a tiny fraction of people to pay them for it to be worthwhile, because these are fairly cheap operations to run.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, the automation makes it like cost nothing, like no effort almost to them. So yeah, I mean, it is an interesting use of, to your point, like machine learning, if you do even go to the point of customization. So I'm going to plug a podcast that I'm actually on, talking a little bit about that, that just got published. It's called The Hacker Mind. And the most recent edition of that is a colleague of mine, Justin, and I talking about adversarial AI and machine learning. So kind of on topic.
Great stuff. Well, we can maybe post that, I'd say in the show notes, but I don't think we actually do show notes here. I was thinking about doing a little joke, be like, make sure you smash that subscribe button. But again, we're on LinkedIn, so not really relevant. I am curious. So for the folks who have finished watching or maybe watch in the future, I'd love to hear your questions. What are you wondering about when it comes to cybersecurity? Could be business related, could be finance related, could be more IT centric. Would love to hear the questions that are on your mind, either as it relates to what's happening in the news now, or maybe situations that you're seeing in your own business. We're going to wrap here. Any final thoughts, Mr. Paterson?
Just two things. What you just said, totally would love to hear from people. If we can make these sessions that we enjoy doing, genuinely, like if we can make them more informational or helpful to you, then please tell us what direction we can bring the conversations in. Between the two of us, there's a lot of years of experience here. I had hair when I started in this industry, so that's how long I've been doing it.
I'm trying not to say anything.
Thanks. So yeah, if we can make it more helpful, then we would love to. And then I think the other thing I would just say is, I floated this by you the other day, so I'm going to put you on the spot and get you to commit to it. But I'd love to do like a year-end one as well too. And maybe we'll get some people on and just have a bigger conversation. I think that'd be fun to do again. We did that a couple of years ago. So.
Well, that'd be good. So why don't we make the ask twofold? If you have questions just generally, drop those. And then second, if you have either people that you would nominate for that year-end review, or topics, and then we can go find the people for that year-end review. Those would be the two sets of suggestions that we will be soliciting.
Awesome. Always fun.
Have a great weekend, everybody.
Cheers.